What I want to do is, first, if you're new here, we've been covering the book of Exodus since I got here, which is about 8 weeks ago, 8 weeks ago. And we started, I think, with the Red Sea. Is that right? Did we start with the Red Sea? Yeah. So we started with the Red Sea, and we end our trip through Exodus today. And we covered a few stories in there, but we really left a lot out as well. So the other day, I saw some of our kids drawing, and I thought, we should just re-illustrate some of the parts of the story with drawings from the kids. So can I use Dawn Marie and Al? Can you just help me for a second here? So you can take that end, Dawn Marie. Al, if you want to come over here. Okay, great. That's good. That's good. You don't need to go quite that far. So the book of Exodus picks up with the people, and they're in Egypt. And there's this baby that's born. And Pharaoh is unhappy, so he orders the slaughter of all the babies. And which sounds very familiar to something in the New Testament as well. And Moses is put in a basket, and he's sent along the river. So we have Moses in the bulrushes. Excellent. I hope your arms don't get too tired. So next slide. Bruce, can you flip through the pictures for me? Then there's the burning bush, which, what a great photo, huh? What was his, the stick figure? No shoes. He kind of looks like he's collapsed right onto the... I don't mean to make fun. I really think these are awesome pictures. So there's this calling. And I said, actually, in my very first service here, that Moses, the Jewish rabbis used to teach that the bush was always burning, and Moses was the first one to stop long enough to listen. Okay, and this is really where the story begins, right? It's Exodus 3, and it kind of sets the tone for the rest of the story. Okay, next photo. So then there's the Red Sea. And as Sunday school kids had illustrated with plasticine and red paper. It was awesome. And I love the bad men. Just in case you were wondering, there's bad men that they're running away from. and Moses with a little arrow. So they escape, right? They leave slavery. And that week we talked about the so what question, right? They get to the other side. And it was so what? And so the other day I was trying to find sermon examples, and there's a Simpsons episode, and they ask the same question. They get across the Red Sea, and they're like, so now what? What do we do? So we've got the Red Sea, and okay, what do we have next? Manna and quail. So I was showing this picture, and Alice said, so John, see the quail in the bottom corner? He died praying. Which I just think is the best. Lucy, I know Grace illustrated that one. I think that's awesome. Ken, good sense of humor you taught your kids there. So there's the man and the quail. They're provided for, right? It's this incredible provision, and it happens for their entire 40 years in the desert. And then once they're fed, they also worry about water. So water from a rock, a very gentle photo in comparison to the quail, at least. And there's multiple water stories. There's not just water from a rock. There's also the bitter water, where the water they don't like the way it tastes, and so we've got to spice it up with a log. And then the 10 Commandments, and a good chunk of the story is around the 10 Commandments. and trying to figure out how we're going to live in this land. And not just in this story, but in all the other stories, they talk about all sorts of different commands. And on that week, we talked about some of the other 613 commands. There's 603 beyond the 10 commandments. And so this entire law that's been created. And then we come to today. And this story is from the book of Deuteronomy. And it was just read for us. God takes Moses up the mountain, and he shows them the promised land. He shows them from the mountain where they are all the way to the Mediterranean Sea, and up north and south where the land is so rich and so fertile. And God says, but Moses, you're not going to cross over into that land. So Moses dies, and he's buried. And the text is very specific. It says, Moses was 120 years old. His sight was unimpaired, and his vigor was not abated. So he dies, and they grieve for 30 days. And the text says, then the Spirit of God filled Joshua. And then it goes back to Moses, and it says, never has there been a prophet like Moses, someone who performed miracles so powerful. Yeah, you can put it down. Never has there been anyone like that in the land since then. And there's kind of this emphasis that God knew Moses face to face. So we have this story, but the story is not over. And so I want to just address a few things. I feel like I'm almost cleaning up the little pieces that we've missed along the way. Okay, so the first question is, why can't Moses go to the promised land? His vigor was not abated. His sight was unimpaired. Why can't Moses go to the promised land? So here's where I have to admit some homiletical laziness. So we talked about a few weeks ago the water from the rock story, right? And in that story, the people are thirsty, understandably. The people are thirsty and they whine to Moses, and Moses is upset because they don't feel like God is providing for them. So Moses kind of talks to God, and God says, you know what you're going to do? You're going to take some elders, you're going to go up, and you're going to, there'll be a rock that I point to you, you're going to tap the rock with your staff, and out will come water. So that's the story we talked about. But in the Bible, there are stories that are told twice. And they're told twice, but sometimes in different ways. Okay, so let me give you an example. How many animals did Noah bring on the ark?
2 of every species.
2 of every species. Right. In one story. There's another story where Moses brings 7 of all the, Noah brings 7 of all the clean animals and 2 of all the unclean animals. They're back to back, they're contradictory, and they're there in the scriptures. So, there is another story of the water from the rock. And this one happens in the book of Numbers. In the book of Numbers, the basics of the story are the same. The people are thirsty. They complain to Moses. Moses complains to God. God says, Moses, take some people, go up. Listen, such a subtle difference. Speak to the rock, and water will come out. Moses goes up, goes to the rock, and he hits the rock twice. Water comes out of the rock nonetheless. He hit the rock. He didn't speak to the rock. God says, because you didn't follow my command, you will not make it to the promised land. Like, wow, what do you do with that? That's so frustrating. Just like, oh, I'm sorry, I got your instructions ever so slightly wrong. And he can't make it to the promised land. Think about what he's been through. Think about all he's endured, and he can't make it to the promised land. So I'm going to try just to explain this a little bit, but don't rebel on me while I'm explaining it, okay? So there's this idea in these scriptures that the punishment for sin is death. It's a little bit formulaic almost. The punishment for sin is death. Now, let's call it a metaphor, because I think it is. Okay? So the people, when they mess up, which they inevitably do, which we inevitably do, the punishment for sin is death. And let me say, death doesn't just have to be physical, it can be metaphorical. Okay? So in this story, if the leader screws up, he must be held to the same account as everyone else. So even the smallest fumble will cause a consequence. Okay? So that's why Moses doesn't make it to the promised land. I realize that that may not satisfy your curiosity. So I'll write about it a little, and when I post it on the website, we can explore our conversation through that as well. Which brings another question. Why are we finishing our journey through Exodus in the book of Deuteronomy? Because all our scriptures to this point have been Exodus, whatever chapter, whatever number, and now I'm reading you the end to the book of Deuteronomy. So, another Bible 101 lesson. Each book of the Bible is talking about and focusing on a specific thing. Each one has, let's say, an agenda that it's trying to convey. Okay, so each book, all 66 of them, have an agenda that they're trying to convey. And each of those books was written by an author, and that author is an agenda that he's trying to convey. Okay? And different people have different accounts and different foci. So let me give you an example. If we were to say to Margaret Atwood and Gabriel Garcia Marquez and J.K. Rowling, okay, so a writer of 100 Years of Solitude, Harry Potter, and The Handmaid's Tale and The Year of the Flood, let's ask them all to write their own version of Exodus. They're each going to have a very different way of going about it. Right? If you've read any of those, you know that they each have a different way. One's more narrative, one's more skeptical, one uses magic realism. And so they all have different ways about going. They have different sentence structures. They have different ideas, different messages and emphasis that they're trying to convey. And the same holds true for the different scriptures. So if you were to read to the end of the book of Exodus, it doesn't finish with the death of Moses. The end of Exodus finishes with the creation of the tabernacle, which is like a tent. We talked about it last week. A tent where people can come and meet. That's how the end of Exodus. The end of Leviticus and Numbers happens when a certain amount of law has been revealed in a certain place. The end of Deuteronomy is the right on the cusp of the promised land. And Moses is speaking to the people about their relation to the law and their relation to God. And it ends as they're ready to cross over. So these first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, they're all telling this central beginning story of the Hebrew people. And moreover, they're setting it up for the next iteration. Have you ever seen a movie? Lauren and I were trying to think of one last night. Have you ever seen a movie with a cliffhanger? Where you clearly tell they're setting it up for a sequel? Like the movie 300, right? He tells a story, and the last scene is them on a mountaintop, and they're getting ready for a different battle, another battle. I was trying to think of another movie. Can anyone think of one off the top of their head? A sequel? Anyways, clearly, sometimes movies are set up for a sequel, like Iron Man and Spider-Man. They're all kind of set up for those. Lord of the Rings. Yeah, and I honestly don't know Lord of the Rings that well, but Lauren tells me it does. I don't have a better explanation for that. Terrible. So there's a sense that this story is also setting up what is to follow. Okay, so that's why we're in Deuteronomy and not Exodus. So ultimately, what do we learn from this story? What do we learn from these pieces? First, there's a probability that there's a calling to do a new thing. Moses was 80 years old before he was called. He was 80 years old before he was invited to lead the people out of Egypt. He's called to do a new thing. The United Church of Canada, we are almost 90 years old. And we are asking this question to ourselves: what does it mean to do a new thing? And maybe you're being called to do the same thing. Maybe it's to move from the place you are now. Maybe it's to move a job or to move into a different place, a different way of being. Maybe you're being called to do a new thing. And this is a reality that mistakes will be made. Like, if anyone knows that, it's the church for almost half of its history now has been trying to figure out how to deal with the mistakes that it made. And I, as your new leader, will make mistakes. Many, many mistakes. I will say things that you don't like and that are probably wrong. And I will do things that you don't like because they're wrong. And I will preach things that I find out later are wrong, which I've already done. Okay? Like, I will make mistakes, and you will make mistakes too. There's a probability, a very high probability, that mistakes will be made. A reality. And there's also the possibility that we will meet God face to face. Last week we had a tent set up here, if you remember that. And the conversation in the tent was all around Moses and God. And they were so close. Anyone remember that word? Karov. It's okay if you don't. And so, closeness and intimacy. Can we find that as a community? Can we nurture an atmosphere where that is possible together? I think we can. There's a hope that someone will take up the dream. This is a big fear for the church these days, that no one will take up the dream. Who will fill these seats? Who will follow the story? Who will educate the children about this story? I don't know. But our hope is that somebody will take up this dream. So, we fast forward many thousands of years to a night in Memphis, Tennessee, where a man by the name of Martin Luther King Jr. had a speech. And in part of the speech, he references the same text that we have today. Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead. But it doesn't matter with me now, because I've been to the mountaintop and I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. He's allowed me to go up to the mountain, and I've looked over, and I've seen the promised land, and I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. We're being called into a new thing. If we are, there's a reality that we're going to make some mistakes. There's the possibility that we will see God face to face. And a hope that we will tell the story and that somebody will tell the story after us. Amen.